For as long as humans have drawn lines on paper, we've drawn ourselves at the center of them. Every civilization, every empire, every explorer, believed that the world began where they stood. In a candlelit workshop in the late 15th century, a European mapmaker bends over a piece of parchment. The ink smells of iron and salt. His hand moves carefully, tracing coastlines he has never seen, filling empty spaces with monsters, gods, and imagination. In one corner, a Latin phrase curls around the edge of the world, Hic sunt dracons, meaning here be dragons. The phrase wasn't just superstition. It was a confession, a quiet admission that even the bravest minds of the age were mapping their ignorance as much as their knowledge. And yet, these maps would come to define reality. They would decide who owned the world, who discovered it, and who, supposedly, did not exist until someone found them. This is the story of how the world was redrawn. Of how explorers, merchants, and monarchs built empires not just with ships and swords, but with pens and lies. It's a story about the greatest act of imagination in human history, when maps stopped describing the world and started creating it. Long before Columbus dreamed of sailing west, long before Magellan circled the earth or da Gama rounded Africa's horn, the world was already deeply connected. It wasn't a world of empty continents or untouched wilderness. It was a world of travelers, traders, and storytellers, of ancient sailors who knew the sea like we know the streets of our cities. The forgotten navigators across the Pacific, centuries before Europe built its first compass, the Polynesians mastered the ocean. In canoes stitched with fiber and faith, they followed the stars, the currents, the color of clouds. They reached islands thousands of miles apart, from Samoa to Hawaii, from Tahiti to New Zealand, guided only by memory and sky. To them, the ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a road. Every wave had a rhythm. Every bird a message. Every horizon a promise. Meanwhile, across another sea, the Indian Ocean, Arab and African sailors had already built vast networks of trade. From the coasts of East Africa to the markets of India and the ports of China, goods and ideas flowed like tides. Ivory, spices, fabrics, mathematics, and stories moved with the monsoon winds. The Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, were thriving global ports, connected to Arabia, Persia, India, and even Indonesia. And on the other side of the world, Chinese fleets under Admiral Zheng He sailed massive treasure ships, far larger than anything Europe had ever built. Between 1405 and 1433, his armadas reached the coasts of India, Arabia, and Africa. Some historians even suggest his ships may have sighted lands beyond the Pacific, though that remains debated. Zheng He's voyages were not about conquest. They were about connection. He carried gifts, not guns. His maps showed routes of respect, not borders of empire. But while the Chinese turned inward after his death, Europe turned outward. And that decision, born from curiosity, competition, and greed, would reshape the world forever. In medieval Europe, knowledge of the world was a patchwork of myth and faith. Maps weren't tools for navigation. They were visions of theology. Jerusalem sat at the center. Paradise floated somewhere to the east. The world was drawn not as it was, but as the Church believed it should be. The unknown wasn't something to explore, it was something to fear. Yet fear, when mixed with ambition, is a powerful fuel. By the late 1400s, Europe was changing. The printing press spread ideas faster than ever. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 cut off old trade routes to Asia. Gold was running low. Kingdoms needed new paths to power. And somewhere in a small Italian port city, a sailor named Christopher Columbus began to dream. Columbus didn't set out to prove the earth was round. Educated people in his time already knew that. What he wanted was a shortcut, a westward route to the riches of Asia. But his math was wrong. He underestimated Earth's circumference by thousands of miles. If the Americas hadn't existed, his ships would have vanished in endless ocean. When he finally sighted land in 1492, he believed he had reached the islands off Japan. He called the people he met Indios, Indians, because he thought he was in the Indies. He died never realizing he had stumbled upon two vast continents unknown to Europeans. Yet, Europe celebrated him as a hero. Because heroes make better myths than mistakes. The word discovery became one of the most powerful in history. It implied that a land had been hidden, waiting, silent, until someone from Europe arrived to reveal it. But millions of people already lived there, with languages, governments, trade, and stories older than any European crown. When Columbus discovered the Caribbean, he met the Taino, a people with organized societies, skilled agriculture, and rich spiritual traditions. Yet within decades, disease, slavery, and violence nearly erased them. In official reports, the devastation was described as civilizing the New World. In truth, it was the destruction of the old. Before European ships crossed the Atlantic, the Maya civilization had charted the stars with more precision than any European astronomer. The Inca civilization built road systems longer than Rome's. The West African empires of Mali and Songhai minted gold, traded across the Sahara, and recorded history in libraries at Timbuktu. When the European explorers came, they didn't discover a new world. They entered one that was already ancient, already mapped, named, and known by its people. But Europe brought something new, a way of seeing the world that turned maps into weapons. For them, to draw was to own. To name was to claim. For centuries, Europe's story of discovery erased others. The Vikings who reached North America around 1000 CE, 500 years before Columbus, were largely forgotten until modern archaeology uncovered their settlements at L'Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland. The African voyagers of Mali, who may have crossed the Atlantic under Emperor Abubakar II, remain shadows in legend. Even in Asia, vast maritime kingdoms like Srivijaya, once controlling the trade between India and China, faded from maps when European powers took over. These civilizations didn't vanish. Their stories did. Because history is written by the mapmakers, and mapmakers worked for kings, when a mapmaker sat down to draw the world, he faced a choice: he could draw what was known or he could fill in the blanks. Those blanks, the unknown, became the canvas for imagination, and later, justification. Every blank space was an opportunity, for faith: here lies Eden; for fear: here be monsters; for conquest: here lies Terra Nullius, land belonging to no one. And thus began the age of discovery, which was, in truth, an age of claiming. The first sails to cross the Atlantic weren't carrying explorers. They were carrying ideologies, of ownership, empire, and destiny. But before the world was divided, it had once been shared. Before borders, there were journeys. Before conquest, there was curiosity. The world had always been connected, long before Europe drew lines to prove it. The 15th and 16th centuries were an age of miracles and myths. Empires were hungry, religions were restless, and knowledge itself was changing form. The compass had found the sea. The printing press had found the mind. And together, they would remake the world. But what was remade was not always what was real. For in this age, truth and legend sailed on the same winds. And when the ships returned home, it was not salt or gold that changed the world, it was the stories they carried that in 1492, 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, left Spain under the flag of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Their captain, Christopher Columbus, promised to reach Asia by sailing west. He called it a mission of faith, to spread Christianity and to find a sea route to the Indies. But beneath the hymns and prayers was another purpose: wealth, spices, silk, gold. The riches of the East had become Europe's obsession. When Columbus reached the Caribbean islands, he wrote in his journal, "These people are loving, without greed, and gentle." Yet, in the same breath, he added, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all." This duality, admiration and domination, became the heart of the European encounter with the so-called New World. Within weeks, Columbus claimed the islands for Spain. Within years, he was capturing and enslaving their people. He believed he was still near Asia, among the Indies. So the people he met, Taino, Arawak, and others, would be called Indians for centuries to come. The mistake would outlive the man. When Columbus returned to Spain, he carried no gold, no spices, and no proof of Asia. But he did carry something far more powerful, a story. He spoke of vast lands, gentle people, and endless opportunities. He promised a gateway to paradise, to fortune, and to God's glory. And Europe believed him. The printing press multiplied his words. Pamphlets, woodcuts, and early maps spread across the continent. His discovery became a symbol of divine favor, the moment Europe stepped into its destiny. Never mind that he never reached Asia. Never mind that the people he found were not lost. In the European imagination, the world had been reborn. Soon, others followed. Italian sailors, Portuguese navigators, English privateers, all chasing the horizon Columbus had unveiled. But there was one man who would give this new world its name, Amerigo Vespucci. Born in Florence in 1454, Vespucci wasn't a nobleman or a conqueror. He was a merchant, a thinker, and later, a navigator. Between 1497 and 1504, he joined several expeditions along the coasts of South America. He didn't discover those lands. Indigenous civilizations had thrived there for millennia, but he made a bold claim: these lands were not Asia at all, they were something entirely new, a mundus novus, a new world. His letters, full of wonder and exaggeration, were published and spread through Europe. He described exotic animals, strange constellations, and naked peoples who lived without kings or property. Whether Vespucci actually wrote all those letters himself remains uncertain. Some were likely edited or even forged by publishers hungry for profit. But it didn't matter. His name, Amerigo, Latinized as Americus, would soon label a continent. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller was working on a new world map, one of the first to depict both hemispheres. He read Vespucci's published accounts and was convinced this new world was indeed separate from Asia. In tribute, he wrote on his map, "America, from Americus, the discoverer." With that stroke of ink, 2 vast continents received their European name. Columbus, who died believing he had reached Asia, would never know that another man's name had replaced his in history. And so, America, a continent of hundreds of nations and languages, became, on paper, a single discovery. A myth was sealed in map ink. Before the 15th century, knowledge was controlled, by kings, by monks, by scholars who copied texts by hand. But now, with Gutenberg's press, ideas traveled faster than ships. Explorers became celebrities. Pamphlets sold like songs. A voyage was not truly successful until it was printed. Reports were dramatized. Dangers were exaggerated. Natives became savages or souls to be saved. And explorers became saints of empire, brave men conquering chaos. Yet the real world was more complex. Letters from sailors and priests revealed starvation, rebellion, and cruelty. Indigenous people resisted, negotiated, and sometimes welcomed, but never simply submitted. Still, the printed story was simpler. Europe brought light to darkness. And that version, repeated in maps, books, and classrooms, would define centuries of belief. These three words, faith, gold, and glory, were the pillars of European exploration. Each voyage served a purpose: to spread Christianity, to find wealth, and to bring honor to the crown. In the name of faith, missionaries followed soldiers. In the name of gold, kingdoms financed impossible risks. And in the name of glory, men gambled their lives for immortality. But in pursuit of these goals, a new idea took root, the doctrine of discovery. In 1493, just a year after Columbus's voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued a decree called Inter Caetera. It granted Spain the right to claim lands discovered west of a certain line, lands not ruled by any Christian prince. The key phrase, discovered by Christians. It meant that if a place was not known to Christian Europe, it could be taken, no matter who lived there. This doctrine became the moral and legal foundation of colonialism. It justified conquest, slavery, and the erasure of entire nations. To discover something, in European law, meant to make it real, as if it hadn't existed before being seen. Maps became legal documents. Names became ownership. By the early 1500s, the Caribbean was already transformed. Sugar plantations replaced villages. African slaves replaced dead indigenous laborers. The Spanish crown grew rich, and the myths of discovery grew stronger. Explorers like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro marched into the heart of empires, the Aztec and the Inca, bringing destruction in the name of civilization. In their chronicles, they wrote not of invasion, but of encounter. Not of conquest, but of conversion. And back in Europe, the maps kept changing, growing larger, more confident, more certain. The oceans no longer held dragons. Now they held opportunity. By 1520, the world on paper looked nothing like the world as it was. The unknown had been filled in with ambition. Europe stretched its influence across oceans, but its map still centered itself, literally. The rest of the world was painted around it like decoration. The purpose of maps had changed. They were no longer tools for travelers. They were instruments of empire. Each new chart drew borders that did not yet exist, and in doing so, created them. A simple line on parchment could divide peoples, decide wars, and erase cultures. When a ship planted a flag, a map confirmed it. And when a map named a land, history remembered that name, not the one its people had always used. The myth of the brave explorer discovering unknown lands became Europe's favorite story. It fed schoolbooks, songs, and national pride. But behind every discovery was a silence, the silencing of those who were already there. Every new name replaced an old one. Every claim erased a memory. And every map told a version of the truth that favored its maker. To discover was not to see for the first time, it was to declare for the first time. To say, now that we see it, it exists. That belief, born in the 15th century, still echoes in our world today. The age of maps and myths was not just a time of exploration. It was a time when imagination became authority, when stories printed in ink became stronger than voices spoken in the wind. As Europe's ships grew larger, so did its legends. And the maps that once whispered of dragons now whispered of destiny. But behind the lines and colors, something else was happening, something the maps would not show. Entire civilizations were collapsing. Others were rising in resistance. The New World was not discovered. It was invaded, renamed, and rewritten. And so, as the age of exploration continued, the world's borders began to harden, and the idea of the other was born. By the early 1500s, the world was changing faster than anyone could draw it. The oceans, once feared as endless voids, had become highways of power. Every voyage, every map, every claim, reshaped not only geography but destiny. For the first time in history, the entire world was being divided, not by mountains or rivers, but by ink. Empires were no longer built on land. They were built on paper. In 1494, 2 years after Columbus's first voyage, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. It was, in essence, a line on a map, an invisible border running north to south, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything west of that line would belong to Spain. Everything east, to Portugal. The Pope blessed it. The King signed it. And with that single stroke, half the planet was given away, by men who had never seen it. Entire continents, peoples, and civilizations were now possessions, parceled out like land in a royal garden. It was a moment when imagination replaced reality, and law replaced humanity. The Spanish and Portuguese empires raced across oceans with crucifixes in one hand and cannons in the other. Each new shore brought the same pattern: arrival, astonishment, alliance, then conquest. When Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519, he was awed by what he saw. The Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, was a metropolis of stone temples, gardens, and shimmering canals. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of his soldiers, later wrote, "When we saw the city, we were struck with awe. It seemed like the enchantments from the Book of Amadis." The Spaniards compared it to Venice, only grander. But admiration quickly turned to ambition. Within 2 years, the Aztec Empire fell. The weapons that brought it down were not just steel and gunpowder, but disease, deception, and belief. Smallpox, measles, and influenza traveled faster than any ship. Within decades, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished, one of the greatest human catastrophes in history. The conquerors saw it as divine favor. The church called it destiny. But it was devastation. As cities emptied and nations fell silent, new flags rose above them. And on maps back in Europe, the land was repainted, its names replaced with Spanish, Portuguese, English, or French words. The old world, the true world, was fading from memory. For the Taino, the first to greet Columbus, their fate was sealed within decades. By 1550, almost their entire population was gone, not by natural extinction, but by exploitation, forced labor, and disease. The Maya, Inca, and Aztec civilizations, whose cities were once marvels of architecture and astronomy, were reduced to ruins, or turned into Christian missions. The conquerors wrote of their victories. But the conquered had no one left to write of their loss. Their stories survived in fragments, songs whispered, carvings hidden, codices burned yet partially remembered. The world was being rewritten. The doctrine of discovery, that Pope's decree granting Christian nations the right to claim unknown lands, became more than law. It became ideology. The idea spread far beyond Spain and Portugal. England, France, and the Netherlands all adopted it. Even centuries later, it would echo through colonial law in North America, Australia, and Africa. According to the doctrine, lands not ruled by Christians were empty, legally and spiritually. Their inhabitants were considered part of the landscape, not its owners. It was a theology of erasure, sanctified by power. Wherever the sword went, the cross followed. Missionaries sailed alongside soldiers, carrying Bibles translated into dozens of languages. Some genuinely sought to help, to educate, to heal. But others came to replace, not to coexist. Whole languages vanished as European languages replaced them. Temples were demolished, idols burned, and churches raised on sacred ground. To erase a people, one first erases their names, their gods, their stories. And that is what the maps did, silently, efficiently, beautifully. In candlelit workshops, mapmakers back in Europe received reports from sailors and missionaries. They rarely saw the lands they drew. Instead, they imagined them, shaped by rumor, ambition, and royal commission. A mountain could become a kingdom. A myth could become a continent. A coastline, incorrectly traced, could start a war. But accuracy was not the goal. Power was. Each map bore the insignia of a crown, Spain's, Portugal's, later England's and France's. The edges of the world glowed with their colors. The uncolored parts, the unknown, were opportunities waiting to be seized. When explorers returned home, the first thing the crown demanded was not treasure, it was charts. Maps were secrets of state, guarded as fiercely as gold. Whoever controlled the map, controlled the narrative. The Portuguese kept their world maps under lock and key in Lisbon, punishable by death if copied. The Spanish Casa de Contratación in Seville was a fortress of geography, where only royal cartographers could update the official, master map of the empire. To draw the world was to define it, and to define it was to own it. By the mid-1500s, new players entered the game, England and France. The English, under John Cabot, explored the northern Atlantic, searching for the fabled Northwest Passage to Asia. The French sent Jacques Cartier up the St. Lawrence River. None found what they sought, but they found something else, opportunity. While Spain and Portugal ruled the south, England and France turned their gaze north, toward the lands of forests, furs, and fish. The idea of the New World was no longer one empire's dream. It was everyone's. And each nation brought its own version of the same lie, that these lands were waiting for them. As European maps expanded, the world's older maps, the knowledge of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, faded from view. The libraries of Timbuktu, once home to thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and geography, were plundered or burned. In the Andes, the quipu, the knotted cords used by the Inca to record history, were destroyed by missionaries who saw them as pagan. In Mesoamerica, Spanish friars burned the Maya codices, irreplaceable libraries of history, astronomy, and philosophy, declaring them works of the devil. Only 3 survive today. An entire universe of knowledge was lost, not by accident, but by intention. Back in Europe, the Age of Discovery was celebrated in art, song, and legend. Painters portrayed explorers as noblemen gazing toward the horizon, faces aglow with divine purpose. Royal courts commissioned epic poems to glorify their deeds. But for the millions across the oceans, discovery meant enslavement, epidemic, or extinction. The very word, discover, once meaning to uncover, came to mean to conquer. The more the maps filled with color, the more the world lost its voices. By 1600, Europe's worldview had inverted. The center of civilization, once shared among many cultures, now lay firmly in the West. The Americas, Africa, and Asia were drawn smaller on maps, not just by geography, but by perception. The Mercator projection, developed in 1569, distorted the world to make navigation easier. It enlarged Europe and shrank the global South. It was convenient, not just for sailors, but for ideology. Europe was now, quite literally, larger than life. By the early 17th century, the Age of Discovery had transformed into the Age of Empire. Spain ruled from Mexico to Peru. Portugal dominated Brazil, Africa's coasts, and the Indian Ocean. England was rising, planting its first colonies in North America. France followed suit, carving out Canada and the Caribbean. The seas belonged to those with the best maps, and the boldest myths. Each empire claimed to bring civilization. Each empire believed it was chosen. Each empire used the same justification, discovery. And all of it began with a single lie, that the world was waiting for them. The world was not discovered. It was divided. And as maps grew fuller, the truth grew emptier. What had once been a shared planet became property. What had once been a circle of connection became a pyramid of power. The world was redrawn, and the map, for centuries, would never again tell the truth. Maps, they are supposed to tell the truth. But for centuries, they told us a story, one drawn not with ink, but with power. They shaped how we saw the world, who we thought mattered, and who disappeared between the lines. In the hands of kings and cartographers, maps became weapons, elegant, persuasive, and devastating. They did not just chart the world. They created it. A map is never neutral. Every map has a purpose, and a master. In medieval Europe, maps were drawn not for travelers, but for believers. The Mappa Mundi of the 13th century placed Jerusalem at the center of the earth, not because of geography, but because of faith. At the top of the map, not north but east, was the Garden of Eden. At the bottom, strange creatures, dog-headed men, giants, and monsters, symbolized the edges of the known world. It wasn't a chart. It was a sermon. A vision of divine order, not of distance. The message was clear: Europe was near the center, and everything beyond was other. That worldview would outlast the Middle Ages. Long after the monsters were gone from maps, the myth of centrality remained. In 1569, a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator unveiled something revolutionary: a new world map. It was practical, mathematical, and elegant. Unlike earlier maps, Mercator's projection straightened the world's curved surface into a rectangle, allowing sailors to navigate using straight compass lines. It was a triumph of geometry. But it came with a price. To preserve direction, Mercator distorted size. The further from the equator you went, the larger the lands appeared. Greenland looked as big as Africa. Europe seemed vast and central. Africa, South America, and Asia, the homes of most of humanity, appeared smaller, almost diminished. It was not meant as propaganda. But it became one. For centuries, the Mercator map would dominate classrooms, war rooms, and governments. It would shape minds long after empires fell. To understand the power of Mercator's projection, one must understand its timing. The 16th century was an age of conquest, commerce, and conversion. Nations were expanding faster than knowledge could follow. A map was not just a tool, it was a statement of dominion. To appear large was to seem important. To be placed at the center was to matter. Europe's enlargement on the map matched its ambitions in the world. Over time, people began to think of the distorted image as natural, as truth. It subtly told every schoolchild that Europe and North America were the world's core, while Africa and the global South were peripheral. The geography of the mind had been rewritten. Maps, at their heart, are stories about perspective. Who you are determines what you see. When Europeans began to map Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries, they filled its interior not with mountains or cities, but with emptiness. Vast regions were marked simply, terra incognita. Unexplored. Savage lands. These weren't descriptions, they were invitations. To explorers, missionaries, and conquerors, blank spaces meant permission. To claim, to name, to control. But the land was never empty. The Kingdom of Benin, the Empire of Mali, the Ashanti, the Zulu, the Songhai, the Ethiopians, these civilizations thrived with systems of law, trade, and art that rivaled Europe's. Yet, because they weren't on European maps, they were treated as if they didn't exist. To name something is to own it. When explorers discovered rivers, mountains, or islands, they rarely asked what the locals called them. The new names, Victoria Falls, Mount Elgon, Lake Albert, Cape of Good Hope, carried the memory of monarchs, patrons, and saints. They erased thousands of years of indigenous language and heritage, replacing them with colonial vocabulary. In this way, maps didn't just depict empire, they became its language. Every line, every label, every compass rose was a claim of ownership disguised as art. By the 18th and 19th centuries, maps were at the center of a new ideology, manifest destiny, the belief that expansion was both inevitable and righteous. In the Americas, frontier maps portrayed the continent as open space, ripe for settlement. Indigenous nations were shown as dotted lines or faded territories, as if they were already disappearing. In Africa, the scramble for Africa of the 1880s began not on battlefields but in boardrooms, during the Berlin Conference of 1884. There, European diplomats drew lines across maps of Africa, dividing entire civilizations into colonies without ever setting foot there. It was the Treaty of Tordesillas reborn, now done with rulers and pens instead of swords. When the conference ended, only two African nations remained independent, Ethiopia and Liberia. The rest were parceled out like pieces of property. Once the lines were drawn, they became real. Colonial administrators used maps to justify their presence. They built railways, plantations, and borders that still scar the continent today. Those lines, created in European offices, ignore tribes, languages, and histories. Communities that had coexisted for centuries found themselves divided by invisible fences. Others, once separate, were forced together, setting the stage for future conflict. Maps became the blueprint of control, silent but permanent. To the colonized, they were weapons of erasure. To the colonizers, they were symbols of progress. Behind every official map was a human being, a draftsman, an artist, often anonymous. They were not warriors, but their work determined the outcomes of wars. Their compass points replaced gunpowder. Their signatures shaped continents. Many believed they were serving science. In reality, they were serving power. In the archives of London, Paris, and Madrid, some maps even carried red ink markings, secret notations of mineral wealth, slave ports, or friendly tribes. The maps told two stories, one for the public, and one for the empire. By the 19th century, schoolchildren across Europe and America were taught the world through atlases adorned with empire's pride. Britain's colonies were colored pink or red, a sea of crimson stretching across the globe. The caption often read, "The empire on which the sun never sets." Students grew up believing this was natural, that domination was order, and expansion was destiny. Maps had become ideology printed on paper. They trained generations not to question, but to accept. Even in modern times, many of us grew up looking at Mercator maps in classrooms and books, unaware of how they bent reality. On a globe, Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland. But on a Mercator map, they look almost equal. South America appears smaller than Europe, even though it's nearly twice as large. The northern hemisphere seems vast, the southern, marginal. We were all raised on a geography of illusion, one that mirrored centuries of political hierarchy. It's no coincidence that when most people picture the world, they see it centered on the Atlantic, not the Pacific, not Africa, not Asia. The world we imagine is the one that empire designed. In the 20th century, new thinkers began to challenge this cartographic bias. In 1973, German filmmaker and historian Arno Peters introduced the Peters projection, a map that preserved area instead of shape. On the Peters map, Africa and South America regained their true size. Europe and North America shrank. It caused outrage. Critics mocked it as ugly, distorted, and politically motivated. But Peters' point was not aesthetic, it was moral. He argued that maps were not just scientific instruments but moral documents. They shape how we see one another, and how we value one another. He was right. The world's true shape is not just a matter of geography. It's a matter of justice. Across the globe, artists, scholars, and activists began reclaiming the map. Indigenous communities started creating their own maps, marking sacred sites, ancestral territories, and languages erased by colonial borders. African and Pacific scholars redrew maps that placed their continents at the center. In these new visions, the world no longer radiated from Europe outward. It was a network, a web of cultures, histories, and connections. The world was no longer flat, or central, or divided. It was shared. Maps can lie. But they can also heal. A map that restores lost names, forgotten borders, and silenced voices becomes more than a tool, it becomes a form of justice. In recent years, digital cartography has given voice to those once left blank. Projects mapping indigenous lands, slave trade routes, and colonial atrocities are rewriting the world's visual memory. These are not maps of conquest. They are maps of truth. If the story of the past 5 centuries has taught us anything, it is this: the way we draw the world reveals how we see the world. Maps were once instruments of domination. Today, they can be instruments of understanding. But the choice remains ours. Will we keep seeing the world through lines of division, or redraw it as a circle of connection? Once, a map was used to conquer the unknown. Now, it can help us rediscover what was always there: each other. The lines are still there, yes, but maybe, this time, we can read between them. Borders. They look so simple on a map: thin, neat lines separating one color from another. But on the ground, those lines cut through mountains, rivers, and hearts. They divide tribes, languages, and families. They shape wars, migrations, and memories. Every border has a story. And many of those stories began not in the lands they divide, but in Europe, centuries ago, when empire ruled the pen. The ink has dried. But the wounds have not. In the late 19th century, European powers gathered in Berlin, far from the deserts of the Sahara, the jungles of the Congo, or the highlands of Kenya. In polished halls lit by chandeliers, diplomats debated over maps spread across tables. They called it the Berlin Conference. But to Africa, it was the day the continent was carved apart. No African leader was invited. No local voice was heard. They divided the continent by rivers they'd never seen, mountains they'd never climbed, and names they couldn't pronounce. The straight lines we see today across Africa, lines that slice through ethnic groups and ecosystems, were born in that room. It was colonization by geometry. The borders of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East were drawn for convenience, not for coexistence. The British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Germans, each took their slice. The lines ignored history, culture, and connection. The Somali people were split among 5 territories: British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. The U were divided between British Togoland and French Togoland. The Tuareg, once free to roam the Sahara, found themselves scattered across 5 nations. And when independence came in the mid-20th century, those same colonial borders remained. The world map had already accepted them as normal. But the people had not. When Europe left, it did not take its lines with it. It left behind fractured nations, mosaics of tribes, tongues, and loyalties forced under one flag. Civil wars erupted across Africa and Asia in the decades after independence. In Nigeria, the Biafran War tore the country apart in the 1960s. In Sudan, borders drawn by empire led to decades of conflict between North and South, ending only with the birth of South Sudan in 2011. In Rwanda, colonial powers had deepened ethnic divisions between Hutu and Tutsi, divisions that exploded in one of history's darkest genocides. The map, once drawn in arrogance, was now stained with blood. In the Middle East, the map tells another story of foreign hands. During World War I, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain and France secretly negotiated how to divide its lands. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement drew new borders across the Arab world, lines that ignored centuries of tribal, religious, and cultural ties. They carved Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan out of the same ancient soil. The new borders created new nations, but not new peace. The promises made to Arab leaders during the war were broken. The Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, added another layer of tension that would define the next century. Today's conflicts in the Middle East, from Baghdad to Gaza, still echo those decisions made in secret rooms 100 years ago. The past is not past. It breathes through every map. Look at a world map today, the fingerprints of empire are everywhere. In India and Pakistan, the border was drawn overnight in 1947. A British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before, was tasked with dividing one of the world's oldest civilizations in just 5 weeks. His pen sliced through Punjab, Bengal, and Kashmir, separating villages, rivers, and families. When the partition took effect, millions were uprooted. Trains carrying refugees crossed paths, some full of the life, others lifeless. It was one of the largest migrations in human history, and one of the most tragic. Even today, the border between India and Pakistan glows bright with floodlights, a line of light marking a wound that never healed. We often think borders bring order. But many of them were born from chaos, created to serve empires, not people. The same British Crown divided the Pashtun people land between British India and Afghanistan. They named it the Durand Line. Across Africa and Asia, colonial powers merged or split communities to suit economic interests. In the Congo, Belgium drew borders to access rubber and ivory. In the Middle East, Britain drew them to control oil and trade routes. In Southeast Asia, France and the Dutch did the same for spice and gold. The modern world map is a museum of imperial priorities, not human ones. Every decade, we see the map shake again. In Europe, Yugoslavia collapsed into war in the 1990s, as ethnic and religious divisions long suppressed by borders resurfaced violently. In the Caucasus, the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh raged for decades. In the Middle East, the line between Syria and Iraq blurred under war and revolution. And in Africa, movements for secession continue, from Somaliland to Cabinda, from Amazonia to Biafra reborn. The past does not disappear. It waits, beneath every map, beneath every nation, like fault lines beneath the earth. For the people living along these borders, the map is not an abstract. It's daily life. In the mountains between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Durand Line, drawn by the British in 1893, still divides the Pashtun people. Families live on both sides, their lands bisected by an invisible line that no one living there agreed to. For them, the border is a rumor. In Africa's Great Lakes region, people cross borders to trade, to visit family, to survive, moving through boundaries that exist only in paperwork. And yet, these invisible lines dictate who belongs, who doesn't, who gets aid, who gets blamed. A border is not just geography. It is privilege and power. Even in places untouched by colonial conquest, the idea of the bordered nation spread across the world. It became the standard of legitimacy. To be recognized, one had to have borders, flags, and treaties. Before empire, many societies existed as fluid networks, tribes, alliances, migrations, trade routes. After empire, the world was locked into boxes. Nomads became refugees. Neighbors became foreigners. Humanity became divided into compartments of belonging. The modern age of passports, visas, and checkpoints, it all began with the colonial obsession with control. But not all lines survive. Some fade, others are erased. In Europe, after centuries of war, nations chose to open their borders through the European Union. Rivers and roads that once divided now connect. It shows that maps can change, if the will exists to redraw them with empathy, not ego. Elsewhere, however, walls rise higher. Barbed wire stretches longer. And satellites patrol skies where once only stars shone. The dream of a borderless world flickers, fragile, yet alive. Borders are not only drawn on maps, they are drawn in minds. They shape how we see us and them. They define identity, nationality, and fear. Colonialism taught us to divide, to measure humanity in lines of difference. Undoing that lesson will take generations. But understanding it begins here, by remembering that the world we inherited was never natural. It was designed. The maps we use today look peaceful, clean, static, final. But every neat border hides centuries of chaos. The lines we take for granted were often drawn in violence and arrogance. They continue to define who lives where, who fights whom, and who gets forgotten. Maps show us the world as it is. History reminds us of the world as it became. The gap between them, that's where humanity lives. In every refugee camp, in every border dispute, in every child learning geography for the first time, the map continues to whisper the story of empire. But perhaps, one day, we can teach them a different lesson, that the earth belongs to no one. That lines are temporary. That connection is older than conquest. And that the map, once a symbol of division, can become a symbol of unity again. For 5 centuries, the world was drawn, divided, and distorted. Empires rose by ink, and fell by fire. Lines carved into maps became walls in the minds of men. But now, something extraordinary is happening. For the first time in history, the power to draw the world no longer belongs to kings, conquerors, or corporations, it belongs to us. We are the new mapmakers. And we are redrawing the world, pixel by pixel, truth by truth. Once, maps were printed on parchment and guarded in royal vaults. Today, they live in our hands. Every smartphone carries a window to the planet, satellites orbit above us, cameras capture the contours of the Earth in real time. From the frozen poles to the depths of the Amazon, the planet has never been more visible. But visibility is not the same as understanding. The modern map, Google Earth, OpenStreetMap, satellite imagery, has given us power. Yet it has also revived an old question: who decides what the world looks like? Because even in the digital age, maps are not neutral. They are narratives. And once again, some voices are louder than others. There are still places missing from our maps, not because they are unknown, but because they are unacknowledged. In many parts of the world, indigenous lands, refugee camps, and rural villages remain invisible to global cartography. To algorithms, they barely exist. In some countries, entire communities are absent from digital maps due to political sensitivity or neglect. Even in the age of information, invisibility remains a form of power. But unlike before, this time, the silenced are redrawing themselves. Across the globe, new generations of citizen cartographers are taking control of their geography. In the Amazon, indigenous groups use GPS and drones to map illegal logging on their lands. In Syria, activists document the destruction of heritage sites, creating memory maps of what war erased. In Africa, Volunteers map informal settlements that were never recorded by colonial surveys. In the Philippines, climate survivors mark flood zones and evacuation paths to protect their communities. In the Arctic, Inuit elders map the shifting ice routes that their ancestors once traveled by stars. For centuries, the map was a tool of domination. Now, it's becoming a tool of liberation. When we zoom in on Earth today, we can see what empire once erased. Ancient trade routes re-emerge beneath desert sands. Buried temples glow again under infrared satellite scans. Sunken cities rise from the deep, revealed by sonar and light technology, once used for control, is now uncovering truth. Every rediscovered ruin, every reappearing name, every remapped tribe is a whisper from the past saying, "We were always here." The world is remembering itself. In universities, museums, and digital archives, a movement is growing: decolonize the map. It challenges the Eurocentric worldviews that shaped centuries of geography. It asks new questions. Why is Europe always at the center of the world map? Why is North always up? Why do colonial names still define sacred lands? Scholars, artists, and indigenous historians are offering alternatives, maps that flip the world, rotate it, re-centralize it. In one, the Pacific Ocean lies at the heart of the Earth, connecting continents rather than separating them. In another, Africa and South America stretch to their true proportions, immense, powerful, central. These maps don't change geography. They change perspective. And perspective, after all, is what maps were always about. For thousands of years, before lines and borders, many ancient civilizations saw the Earth not as a divided map, but as a circle. To the Polynesians, the sea was a web of relationships. To the First Nations, the land was a living being, not property. To African kingdoms, trade routes were rivers of connection, not boundaries. The idea of ownership was foreign, the idea of belonging, sacred. In many ways, the old wisdom is returning. As climate change, migration, and globalization blur the old borders, humanity is rediscovering what the ancients knew: the Earth is shared. Its health, its fate, and its story belong to all. The 21st century has given us something empires never imagined: a view of the entire planet at once. From space, there are no borders. No colors. No names. Only one fragile sphere, glowing blue in a sea of darkness. Astronauts who've seen Earth from orbit describe something called the overview effect, a profound realization that national boundaries are illusions, that humanity is one family sharing a single home. It's the oldest truth, rediscovered in the newest way. Perhaps that's the ultimate correction to the map that lied: to remember that the Earth cannot be owned, only cared for. Even as technology evolves, the most powerful maps are not digital or political, they are psychological. We carry maps inside us, maps of belonging, fear, and identity. They tell us where we think we stand in the world. Colonialism drew maps on land. But its deeper legacy was the map it drew in our minds, one that ranked nations, races, and cultures. To decolonize the Earth, we must first decolonize the imagination. We must learn to redraw the world not as a pyramid of power, but as a circle of connection. That is the true map of the future. Today's mapmakers are not empire builders, but truth tellers. They are scientists mapping coral reefs to protect them. Artists mapping memories of migration. Linguists mapping endangered languages before they vanish. Historians mapping slave routes, restoring dignity to lives erased by the Atlantic. Even game designers, filmmakers, and virtual explorers, they all create new ways to see the world. The map has left the paper. It now lives in imagination. And imagination, finally, belongs to everyone. As climate change redraws coastlines, rising seas erase cities, and deserts expand, the maps of tomorrow will not be static. They will be alive, shifting, breathing, warning us. The question is not whether the world will change. It already is. The question is, who will draw it? If history belongs to those who draw the map, then the future belongs to those who redraw it. 500 years ago, maps began as instruments of conquest. But now, they can become instruments of conscience. Every time we trace a lost name, restore an ancient path, or refuse to accept a border as natural, we reclaim a little piece of truth. The new map is not just a picture of the world. It is a mirror of who we choose to be. Imagine, for a moment, the first map ever drawn, not on paper, but on sand, by a human finger pointing toward a horizon. It wasn't about power. It was about wonder. That's where our story began. And perhaps, that's where it must return. Because the truth is simple and eternal, the world does not belong to those who draw the lines, it belongs to those who cross them.